I am here with Dr. Dan Haybron, who is a philosophy professor at St. Louis University. Thanks so much, Dr. Haybron, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, a lot of different subfields talk about this idea of eudaimonia.
Mhm.
What is that?
So, eudaimonia or eudaimonia that's a Greek word that is actually where the English word happiness originally had the same meaning, essentially having to do with good fortune or good luck, like things, a good demon, I think, in the Greek. But so it had to do with, it's the sort of term you would probably you when somebody gets married, you wish great happiness to the newlyweds and so forth. Eudaimonia, and probably most languages have a word like that. And so it has to do with what researchers like myself today usually will call well-being. Flourishing is another word for it. We usually don't, well, in my neck of the woods and science, people working in the sciences, we don't usually use the word happiness for it, just because we tend to use the word happiness for a state of mind and not an ideal of living. So we use happiness, like I use happiness in a way that to talk about a state of mind that I think is important. But somebody else might say, well, yeah, you could be happy, but only kind of stupid people are happy. So eudaimonia is essentially, and for Aristotle and the ancient Greeks, eudaimonia was a word for really ultimately what mattered in life, a good life. And so it encompassed everything. And exactly, yes, is the ultimate good for human beings.
So, it's supposed to be this objective thing that we should all seek?
Yes. So for the ancients, at least the philosophers we read today, there was really an objective answer to what's the best life for us. And there were the Epicureans who thought it was the pleasant life, but even they had pretty strict ideas about how you could have a pleasant life. And if you thought something else mattered besides having a pleasant life or avoiding pain and suffering, then you were just wrong. So they all had kind of objective ideas about it. Aristotle is the best known, and he thought eudaimonia, or flourishing or well-being, what's good for you, is a life of virtuous activity. And the word virtue is a little weird to our ears today. Excellence might be better, doing things well and realizing your capacities as a human being. So it's not just about being a good person, that's part of it, but it's doing things well. It includes having a good sense of humor. Just think of the things that when somebody passes away, and you're thinking, at the funeral, the praise that you give to the person, all sorts of things. It's not just, oh, they're kind, compassionate, fair, but also they're really funny. They were, they had a lot of fortitude and grit, and they just kind of knew, they had the art of living down. So it was a very broad sense of living well.
So, you're using these words not synonymously. Happiness is not the same as well being, flourishing, eudaimonia. Can you help me understand what is the relationship between these?
So the way I use the word, and there's no need for people to argue about the word, like you can use happiness to be synonymous with those other terms, but to avoid getting into verbal arguments, people like me use happiness just to talk about a state of mind. In my case, I think of it as, it's most useful to think of it as emotional well-being, roughly the opposite of anxiety and depression. So, and in fact, I think my favorite happiness measures that are out there today are measures of anxiety and depression. They tend to focus on the negative stuff, but on the other hand, that's the stuff that I think is most important for us to pay attention to is the suffering side of the equation. But there's another way of thinking about happiness as a state of mind, which is life satisfaction, being satisfied with your life. And that's more of a judgment about your life. And so a lot of researchers use the word happiness for having a favorable attitude towards your life. Like you think your life is going well by your standards. And so you might be, say, a teacher, a social worker, or an attorney, and you're doing what you think is worthwhile and what's important in life for you, but you don't feel good. You're stressed. It's just kind of, it's tough. It's hard, but you might be happy in that sense of the word, even if not emotionally, because you're leading the kind of life you want. So again, there's different ways of using these words. I think the most important thing, at least when we're thinking about the state of mind, is the emotional well-being side of it. And that's something, and it's roughly, having a fulfilling life emotionally and having some peace of mind. It's not just feeling cheerful or smiley face. I like the smiley face, but it's really generally another word for it might be psychic flourishing. Like psychologically, you're kind of oriented toward the world in a way that like your life fits who you are very well. And so it's not just emotion, narrow emotion, like feeling happy.
So, am I right to think that you can experience well-being without being happy and be happy without experiencing well-being?
I didn't answer that part of your question, did I, before? So I think it would be harder to experience well-being, to have well-being without happiness, in my view, because I think happiness is kind of the core of well-being, or at least the most important element of it. But it's not the only thing. So, you could be happy in a virtual reality machine, completely disconnected from reality, and like in the Matrix or the Truman Show. And that doesn't seem like a very enviable, like that's not really what anyone wants for their kids. And so there's other things that matter. Lots of debate about that. I think the main other thing that matters is succeeding in the values that you have that define who you are. So the things you really care about. So I value being a philosopher, a parent, a good person, that sort of thing. And so that's an important part of well-being also. So you could, I guess, have well-being without happiness, but it'd be probably not if you're depressed or really doing badly emotionally. And but you could be happy without well-being. I think that's usually not the case. Most people, I think, aren't in the Matrix. I sure hope. But if we are, I don't know.
So you're starting to talk about standards that we could use to judge whether we're fulfilled, whether we're satisfied. But also, you were talking about people upon their death, attributing to them a good life. So do those standards come apart, or like what's the difference if someone says I'm living a good life versus saying of someone else that they are living a good life?
That's a really good question. So I think in either case, well, I'll tell you, I think it's not just subjective. I kind of think almost nothing is subjective, but it is different for different people. So I think a good life, I just spent a few days on the Navajo reservation and they have a very different ethical system from the standard Western one, and different society. Done work in Bhutan, a little Himalayan kingdom, Buddhist kingdom, and so cultures differ a lot, but and people and individuals differ a lot. But there's certain things that if I'm judging somebody else, are they having a good life? Like if I have to give the eulogy at somebody's service, then then you make some allowance for the individual. Like if you're giving the eulogy for an artist, it's going to be different than the eulogy you give for somebody a subsistence farmer in Bhutan, even if you're the one giving it, because you know that what's going to matter, the specifics of what matters in life for those individuals is going to be different. But there are certain things, there are certain things that I do think are kind of universals. Love, doing things well. And, there's kind of, like if you go fishing, you don't catch any fish, that's sometimes a sign that maybe you don't know what you're doing. Or it's a sign that I'm doing the fishing. And even if I know what I'm doing, it's bad luck. But so there's just certain things that are kind of, that I think are universals of human life. And one way of kind of seeing this, people really like to emphasize how different we all are. And we do really have to respect individuality and difference. But call it the Pixar test. Like Pixar, so one of my high school friends makes movies for Pixar. He's retired happily. And they can make movies, you can put their movies anywhere in the world, just about. And as long as they understand how to look at a screen, which is, I'm not sure if there are any cultures that can't, but people will get it. They know that, like in Coco, well, you're probably supposed to root for the kid. And for that matter, if you're watching a Star Wars, nobody really wonders whether Darth Vader is a great guy. So there's a lot of commonality, like the fact that they can make movies that appeal to people in almost every culture. And just one other example is just traveling. I don't know anybody who's traveled, no matter how exotic the culture, where you couldn't make friends with local people. It's hard to make friends with people if you don't have any shared values. If you don't share some degree of honesty, loyalty, kindness, fairness, and how exactly those things play out are very different in different cultures, because life is different in different places. But I think there really is a lot of commonality.
So you're saying that there are objective things that make humans happy. For example, feeling love. For example, being really good at something. So if somebody is unhappy, is there a sense in which you can tell them, look, your happiness is in your control. Go get good at something, go find love, and you'll be happy. Is that how that works?
Not that simple. We do have control over how happy we are to a great extent. So, so one thing we can do is mind training, like meditation. Meditation isn't something you do to relax so much, or at least that's not where it's most useful. It's rather more like training your mind to be able to deal with events without toxic emotions like anger, and you get, freaking out over things, so that so it's like learning to play the piano. And so meditation is one thing you can do. It's not necessarily for everyone, in my opinion, at least, or at least there are some people I know, they're just not going to do it. I mean, it might actually help them, but they're not going to do it. So, but that's one thing that can be very helpful. Other things we can do, I think, focusing on other people, getting outside of ourselves and realizing that it's not just about me. So focusing on other people's needs. People love helping other people. In fact, so here's one of my favorite happiness interventions is help someone else to help someone else. That is, so you've got a friend who's depressed, ask their advice, and then they're helping you, or somehow set it up so that they can do good for somebody else. That makes them feel useful. And that's a really important thing for happiness, is feeling worthwhile, feeling like what you're doing is meaningful and worthwhile. But then also it makes you feel good because you've done something, the same reason you've done something for them. So I love that kind of idea. So spending more time doing things that you're good at. And so there's things like that. Moving sometimes, and just getting out of a toxic environment. But yeah, there's, at the same time though, if somebody has severe depression, there are things that can be done to treat it, and things that you can do, in many cases, to learn to make it a little better or get out of it. but it's not trivial, and it's not just like, turn that frown upside down.
So if you're unwell, you can get closer to being well by doing certain things.
Yeah, and and yes, so you can at least get closer. There's no guarantees, and one of the things, unfortunately, there's just no like one recipe, and this is one area where we are all different, each of us. So some of the advice that I like to give about things you could do, well, a lot of the advice that we researchers give come from a place of privilege. We have certain options available to us where not everybody may have that option, or so then different things are going to work for them. But in general, doing things where you can both improve how you think, and that's kind of creating better habits. And if you can change how you live, that's a really big one. But that's not necessarily easy, especially if you need to take any job you can get in order to pay the bills. And then I guess one last thing is, I think you don't have to be happy to have a good life. And I think I've known a lot of people who I don't think they were very happy. They weren't miserable. They got a lot of enjoyment out of life. They got a lot of good out of life. But, they didn't always have an easy time of it, and they weren't. Now, I think the majority of people are probably neither happy nor unhappy, just somewhere in between. So that's to help understand where I'm coming from on that. So you don't have to, so it's not essential to be happy. It just is really good. And it's a lot better to be happy than not. And I think it's really important. And I think as a society, so I just found out last year, it looks like maybe 40% of Americans showed symptoms of either depression or anxiety disorder, and with the COVID thing. And that's a lot of people who aren't happy, if not unhappy. So that's important for us to do something about. But people can still have good lives. So my, I guess, slogan, if you had to have a slogan, and we all love slogans, for a good life is a life well lived and well worth living. You don't have to be happy to have a life that's well worth living.
Wow.
Like, I think even when I'm not happy, life is a great gift. It's what an amazing, I'm looking out the window in front of me, trees, and there's birds out there, it's fantastic. So there's a lot to appreciate, even when things aren't, going so great for us.
So am I right to understand that your view is the goal is not happiness? You should not be trying to do things to be happy. I mean, that'd be great, but it seems like your focus is on flourishing, well-being, which means a lot more to you than happiness?
Essentially, I'd slice the pie a little differently from Aristotle, but in practical terms, we sort of agree, like, live well, act well, make the most of life. Of course, be a good person. And this is one thing, philosophers disagree about so many things, all these different ethical theories, but we all agree that a good life, the kind of life we should want, involves virtue, being a good person, and doing, living well. And it also involves something anybody in the street would recognize as well-being. Like, it should be reasonably satisfying and not unpleasant. It shouldn't be a veil of tears. We all kind of think a good life would normally, like, that's what we strive for. But happiness itself, there is a lot of truth to the idea that, you don't want to focus too much on what'll make you happy. If you're thinking, am I having fun? You're maybe not going to have so much fun. That doesn't mean you should ignore happiness. So when deciding on a career option, if you do an internship at a law office and realize you hate the job, it makes you miserable, but it pays a lot of money, so you do it anyway. And I've known a lot of people have made essentially that kind of decision. That may not be such a great idea, and it's worth thinking about what makes you happy. but on a daily basis, just doing things that are worthwhile. If you feel like your life is worthwhile and you know, you're not under too much, you don't feel insecure, like you can't pay the bills, then happiness often kind of comes along for the ride. Not always, but often.